Today I'm going to show you a really useful strategy for breaking out of pentatonic boxes to play freely all over the fretboard. We're going to go over 5 blues licks that utilize the 5 positions of the CAGED system. And if you're new to this, then I'm going to show you the fundamental chord shapes and arpeggios you need to get the most out of this. Then we'll apply these fundamentals to come up with some great lines. Let's get into it. So the lines I'm going to show you today fit over the turnaround section of a 12-bar blues. And this is a great place to get started because to get the most out of these CAGED shapes, you have to have a chord progression to play over. So today we're in the key of E, and the chord we're going to start with is our 5 chord, the chord B major. Then we're going to move to the 4 chord A major and finally land on E major. This is the turnaround section at the end of a 12-bar blues. So first up, let's cover these CAGED shapes. So we're going to start right here with this B bar chord shape right here. Now this matches up with this A shape and finally this E shape. Now when we talk about positions, what I mean is I'm not moving my hand horizontally up the neck. I'm staying in one general spot because later on when we cover the arpeggios, it's really useful to be able to play through these chord changes in all these 5 different positions and then tie them together. So once again, we've got this B chord, this A chord, and finally this E chord. Then we can move that up to our next position. Now we've got this B chord, this A chord, and finally this E chord. And then we move that up to our 3rd position, and we've got this B chord, followed by this A chord, and finally this E chord. So a lot of these hand grips are the same. There's only 5 of them. But by moving them around in positions, you reuse some of the same grips for different chords. And this is kind of the key to seeing things laid out across the fretboard. So our 4th position, we move up to this B chord, to this A chord, and finally this E chord. And then our last position, we go up to this B chord, to this A chord, and to this E chord. So now that we've got the basic sort of groundwork laid with these simple chord shapes, we can start to break these down into arpeggios. Now the arpeggios we're going to use are 4-note 7th chord arpeggios. Since this is a blues, all these chords are going to be dominant chords. We've got a B7, an A7, and finally an E7 for that classic kind of dominant blues sound. And these 4-note arpeggios are really great because they lay out really nicely across the fretboard, and they actually lend themselves to some really musical lines. Actually, even just playing the arpeggios themselves can be a part of a musical line, as you see when we get into some of these licks. So again, we're going to start in this lower position. This B chord lays out with this B7 arpeggio. And I'm going to start on the lowest string and move to the top string. In every position, the lowest note you have available isn't necessarily the root. So for this B, the root is here on the A string, but we've got some notes we can play below that. We've got the 5th and the flat 7 of this chord, the note F sharp and A, which we can use. So we've got F sharp, A, B, then our major 3rd, D sharp, and then back to our 5th, F sharp, our flat 7, A, our root, 3rd, 5th, flat 7. So B7 in this position. Then as we move to this A chord, we've got our root right there, but we can come down and play the flat 7 G below it. So we've got G, A, the root, the 3rd C sharp, the 5th E, and then flat 7 root, 3rd, 5th, flat 7 root. And then finally our E7 chord from this position. Here we've got the 3rd G sharp on the bottom, then B the 5th, then D the flat 7, then the root E, and then here we can play the major third, 5th, flat 7, root third. So practice this stuff slow in the beginning, but once you get comfortable with it, you should be able to play through these chord changes playing just the chord tones. These are the key notes to target in your lines and soloing. And we can just sort of run through these. Right there, I've played all the chord tones and made all the changes. And this is super useful when we get into some of our lines. So let's go through the other 4 positions. So now this B7 chord, and again, a lot of these shapes are going to repeat. We played this same shape down here for A, now we're just moving it up. So we can move a little bit more quickly through these. So there's B7, A7, and finally E7. Right, so now we've sort of navigated through 2 sections of the fretboard and really learned the chord tones to these 3 chords. And this is exactly the way I practice this stuff, and it's so useful for this type of playing. So now we move up, we've got this B7 chord, followed by this A7 chord, and finally this E chord. Right, so a lot of repeating shapes and patterns here. It's just a matter of applying them to the different chords in the different spots on the fretboard. So 2 more positions. Now we've got this B7 here, followed by this A, and then this E. So this B7, this A7, followed by this E7. And finally, our last position, we've got this B, let's see, this A, and finally this E. Right, so this can take a while when you're first starting out to get these really committed to memory. You don't have to be able to play these super fast, at least for the style of playing that I like to do. You don't have to worry too much about fingering. It's more about committing them to memory, having sort of a hand and mind connection where you can confidently recall the chord tones to the chords you're playing over. You can visually see them. Your ear starts to hear those notes. That's another great thing about practicing chord tones and arpeggios. Is you're training your ear to pick up on the thirds, the fifths, the sevenths of these chords, which are the key chord tones you want to target in your lines. So now that we've got this basic fundamental stuff kind of together and you can start practicing this, you can take these things and start making them into lines using these chord tones in these different positions, right? All right, so now we're going to play down these 5 licks along to the backing track. This is a shuffle backing track, and I'm playing over this section where we go from B7 to A7 to E7. I'm going to play each lick one time up to speed and then one time slowed down. And all the tabs and notation for this is going to be available to download over on my Patreon, so you can work through these at your own speed. I hope this lesson helps shine a light on some different things you can think about when practicing. A lot of people ask me all the time what to practice. And certainly for soloing and improvising, it's hard to go wrong with this approach to practicing. If you learn your chord tones and you break them down by position across the fretboard, you'll see a ton of improvement in your playing and your knowledge of how to play freely over chord changes all across the board. So spend some time with this. It can take a long time if you're just starting out, but work through these arpeggio shapes and head over to the Patreon site and download these tabs and notation to work through the licks. It'll be really helpful and give you some new vocabulary to start breaking out of those pentatonic boxes and those same positions you may be stuck in. All right, guys, until next time, happy practicing and take care.